So I thought we could start with just a little bit of overview about JDRF and who we are in the type 1 diabetes space. So we are celebrating an organization this year, and in that time, in those 50 years, we have raised $2.5 billion for type 1 diabetes research. And in addition to the funds that we've raised for research, we've also secured an additional almost $3 billion from the US government. So we are truly the leader in this type 1 space, and there is no one fighting harder to find a cure for type 1. So this is a snapshot of our approach. So I feel like this slide is a little overly complicated, but basically what we want to highlight is the fact that we have this holistic approach, and that we are harnessing the power of research and advocacy as well as community engagement to cure type 1 and to improve lives. So those are kind of the two buckets. Curing type 1 and improving lives are the two buckets that we think of our research categories these days. And this slide shows just how we are working to get these breakthroughs to people in the type 1 diabetes community. So I love this slide. It's sort of the pipeline that leads us ultimately to the advancements being delivered to people with type 1. So it used to be in the early days of JDRF 50 years ago, discovery research was the only thing we were doing, right? So kind of that our traditional view of research being done in a laboratory under a microscope. And we continue to invest in discovery research because those things are going to be breakthroughs that happen on down the line. But what's really exciting is the work that we are doing in every point along this pipeline. So it doesn't really matter in a sense that we've cured type 1 diabetes in mice thousands of times, thousands of different ways, but I still have type 1. So what we need to do is all of these other steps, so that translational research, the regulatory approval, right? It doesn't matter to have a new technology or a new therapy if it has not been approved by the FDA. We're not going to be able to take advantage of that. Same thing is true for healthcare coverage and clinical adoption. If the endocrinologists and doctors are not prescribing the new therapy or not aware of it, then it's not going to be reaching our type 1 community. So those are all those different stops along the pipeline where JDRF is working to bring things, new things to people with type 1. So I want to share with you all a couple of examples of research advancements that have happened, and there are so many to choose from, and I get so excited talking about the research. So I've decided to just focus on a handful of things that have happened just in the past year. So it's exciting. I think big picture, I oftentimes, as someone who's lived with type 1 for over 30 years, I think about, how impatient I am and how much I want the advancements to come and come more quickly. But when we stop and look at what has happened over the past year, over the past 5 years, 10 years, it really is remarkable the amount of progress being made. So this first example is in the area of beta cell therapies. So there are a ton of different projects that JDRF is funding and moving forward in this space. This particular project is something that we call beta cell encapsulation. So I'm not sure if that's a term that people are familiar with or not, but basically the idea of beta cell encapsulation is that we want to be able to replace the beta cells, which are the insulin producing cells that have been destroyed in type 1 diabetes. We want to be able to replace them in people with type 1, but we also want to be able to protect them from being killed off by the immune system again. So we actually did a very large scale human clinical trial back, probably almost 20 years ago now, called the Edmonton Protocol. And this was a project that looked at transplanting beta cells into a large group of patients. It was like 350 patients. And we, at the time, thought sort of like, this is it. If we can just find enough source of beta cells, then we can transplant them into people and we'll be on our merry way. Unfortunately, what we realized through that trial is that that same autoimmune response of attacking and destroying those beta cells took place again in that environment. So the idea of encapsulation is, what if we could take those insulin-producing cells and hide them from the immune system? So we like to think of this sort of as a shark tank. So if the shark is the immune attack and the diver is the insulin-producing cell, the encapsulation device is that shark tank. And so what we have been funding, here's an example. So this company called ViaCyte, they were one of the earliest companies that JDRF funded doing this type of work. And, but I think I've sort of lost track. There's more than a handful of different versions of this same idea that JDRF has been funding. But this one, ViaCyte, which is sort of furthest along, this is an actual picture of their device. So you can see it's about the size of a Band-Aid. And I actually got to, at a meeting a couple of years ago, hold a version of the prototype. So it's very flexible and thin. It's thinner than a credit card and super flexible. And this is made of a material that has tiny little microscopic holes in it. And those holes are small enough that the immune attack cannot get in, but they are large enough that glucose and insulin, oxygen, and other nutrients can flow freely. So the idea behind encapsulation is that we could, in a simple outpatient procedure, implant this device, or perhaps several of these devices, just beneath the skin. The human clinical trials of this device have been transplanted, or not even transplanted, inserted just under the skin, kind of in the lower back, kind of in the love handle area. And so what if you could do that every 1.5 to 2 years, have that outpatient procedure, and then in the intervening months live essentially free from type 1 diabetes? So I get goosebumps thinking about that one. What has happened in just the past year is that the human clinical trials of the ViaCyte device have been expanded. And so sort of the first step of those clinical trials was to make sure that the device was safe, it didn't cause any problems or reaction in the body, and to make sure that the body wasn't going to receive the device as foreign and sort of build up scar tissue around it. So we worked through that first stage, and now in this second stage, the results that have come out recently are looking at the fact that the insulin producing cells in this device are actually producing insulin. So they are actually playing a role in glucose control. So it's very exciting, and we feel just thrilled about this next step that has happened, where these devices have proven to work in producing insulin in people with type 1 diabetes. So this most recent version of the trial, people have not been given enough of the beta cells that they are living free of type 1 diabetes, but they are having some insulin production happening on its own, almost like being back in the honeymoon phase, when you're not having a lot of terrible lows and a lot of terrible highs, because there's some insulin production happening to help balance everything out. So this progress is so encouraging, and it's bringing us closer to the goal with encapsulation, which would be kind of this 2 year at a time idea of outpatient procedure. So I get really excited. So this is an example, this would fall under that category of improving lives. So we don't consider this a full biological cure, right? Because there's still intervention being needed on a regular basis. But as someone who lives with type 1 diabetes, I sure think, man, that would be pretty close, pretty close to a cure, pretty close to perfect, to be able to live free of the disease for years at a time. The next example I wanted to share with you all is a drug called teplimizab, and this is a drug that has been used in a long-term clinical trial. I believe the clinical trial was 7 years long, and this clinical trial was run by TrialNet. Some of you may have heard of TrialNet, and that was done with funding from JDRF and the National Institutes of Health. It was actually funded through something called the Special Diabetes Program, which our advocacy team works very hard to secure that federal funding every year. And what's so exciting about what came out this year is that this trial found that this drug delayed the onset of type 1 diabetes in at-risk adults and children for an average of 2 years. So 2 years, people that presumably would have had type 1 on average got to have 2 extra years free from the disease. And what's exciting about this as well is that the trial was done with just one time of this drug therapy. So it was just given this one initial dosage. So what we are excited to do is look at what else could be done with that. Could we deliver that drug sooner, more often? You know, could we increase the number of years? Could we even eventually look at a drug like this reversing type 1 diabetes in people newly diagnosed or even with established type 1 diabetes? So there's a phase 3 clinical trial underway, and that is sponsored by a company called Prevention Bio. And this is a company that has been invested in by the T1D fund. So I want to share with you a little bit about the T1D fund because this is a great example of the work being done there. So this was something that JDRF launched in 2016, and the idea here is that there are all of these exciting developments that happen in the type 1 space, and because we are a relatively small patient population, there's oftentimes not enough incentive for the big pharma companies to come in and invest in kind of this early stage stuff. So there's something that we refer to as the valley of death, where there's kind of like interesting ideas, and then they need to make it through this next phase before they could be attractive enough to attract big pharmaceutical dollars. And so that was part of the reason why we created the T1D fund. The other reason was that we felt like this, so basically this is a venture capital, a philanthropy version of a venture capital fund. We felt like there were these companies and these advancements happening where we could invest in the same way that a venture capital would be invested, where we then could see returns and gains on those things that become successful that we've invested in. So there are, this is an old statistic, 15 companies. It's certainly more than that by now, the number of companies that we have invested in through the T1D fund, and that Prevention Bio is an example of one of those companies working on that prevention drug. So very exciting things happening there, and there are other nonprofits that really have looked to JDRF and the way that we set up the T1D fund, and now other national health nonprofits are doing the same thing, following our lead. So we love being a leader in that way, being innovative. So this example I wanted to share with y'all is in the area of glucose control. So in the past year, the Tandem Control IQ received FDA approval. And as you all may know, this is the second hybrid closed loop system out on the market. So we just love seeing more and more devices become available in this space. Medtronic was the first one available, and now the Tandem device. We have helped make so much happen through the Artificial Pancreas Project, and the clinical trial for this device in particular was also funded by that Special Diabetes Program, which is part of our advocacy efforts. We are also funding an open protocol initiative, and the Tandem device is a great example of where the Tandem pump and the Dexcom CGM are interacting with each other, you know, in an open way. So our vision for that is that there could be essentially an app on your phone, and you could decide which pump you prefer and which CGM you prefer, and have sort of a mix and match scenario to best meet your needs through that open protocol. So we love that there are more of these hybrid closed loop systems in the pipeline, and more to come. And I know for me personally, I'll share, I've been using the Medtronic system basically since a few months after it became available, and it has been really life-changing. So basically it's taking the continuous glucose monitor data and making some decisions in the background about my basal rate, turning the basal rate up a little bit or down a little bit depending on how my blood sugar is trending, in a way that minimizes high and low blood sugars. And the most significant thing for me has been the overnights. I haven't had a single overnight low since using this system, which is absolutely life-changing, transformational, and I'm so grateful for that. And there are times with any technology that it feels frustrating, and sometimes I want to throw it out the window, and then I remember, oh, I woke up in range this morning, it's worth it. So I feel so grateful for the progress that has happened there. And then there was also an FDA grant as a breakthrough device status for this iLet Beta Bionics system. So what is exciting about that, so that also happened in the last year, this breakthrough device program enables the device to go more quickly through the process that it needs to with the FDA to get the regulatory approval so that we can use those devices. And this particular system is interesting. This is Ed Damiano's system, and JDRF has been a funder of him since his early days. And what's exciting about this pump in particular is that it's a dual hormone pump. So all of the systems we have now are just using fast-acting insulin. This version, the iLet Bionic Pancreas, is using both fast-acting insulin and glucagon. So an advantage, obviously, in that it has both the gas and the brakes, so to speak. And this system, you actually set it up and you tell it, I'm trying to think, you enter your weight, and I think that's the only thing you enter. You don't put in any of your ratios or anything like that, and it starts working and does not require the user to count carbohydrates. So that feels like the next big breakthrough, and so we're so excited about that FDA approval to get that approved into patients more quickly. The next example I want to share with you all is this Gore invested in this development of an implantable insulin delivery system. So this company called Physiologic Devices has created basically an implantable pump. They call it the Fin pump, and it's fully implantable and automated. And what's interesting is that because it's implanted, it delivers insulin directly into the abdominal space. So as you all that live with type 1 know, the way that we deliver insulin subcutaneously is the same way we've delivered insulin since insulin was invented, and it's slow, right? If I'm high and I take a bolus, my blood sugar's not coming down in the next 5 minutes, right? It takes a while. But by delivering insulin directly into the abdominal space, it's able to work much more quickly, both work more quickly and be done working more quickly, so you don't have some of that overlapping, multiple bolus type of problems. So they're working towards a human clinical trial in less than 4 years is their goal. And what's exciting about this too is it's a great example of where JDRF was able to attract another investor. Excuse me. So Gore is the same company that's known for making Gore-Tex. So that's what they're known for, but they have been getting into the diabetes space as well. And we're excited to have them funding this. I'm so sorry, y'all, my little tickle. So those are the examples that I was excited to share with y'all about advancements over the past year. Those are not all of them either. There are dozens more. Those are just the ones that I felt excited about sharing with you all. But we truly are at JDRF driving progress. These next couple of slides, I feel like are just a nice point of comparison about how far we've come in those 50 years since we were founded. So in terms of treating type 1 diabetes, how we live with the disease, this picture, of course, is sort of horrifying. It's the first insulin pump ever. And so that's, that's how far we've come. Blood glucose used to be measured with urine strips. I know for me, when I first was diagnosed, we did have blood glucose monitoring at home, but my meter was like the size of a brick. It was really the size of a VHS tape. It was huge. And it took a huge amount of blood to check your blood sugar. You had to wait 2 minutes, which felt like an eternity. And then at the end of the 2 minutes, you would have these two little colors on the strip, kind of like a ketone strip, really. So talk about imprecise, going from that to now having a continuous glucose monitor is just incredible progress. Back in the day, there was no way of knowing who would develop type 1 diabetes. In fact, when I was diagnosed, I have a younger sister. My parents, of course, asked, is she at risk? And she was told at the time unequivocally, no, she's not at any risk at all for developing type 1. We now know that that's not true. Thankfully, my sister is free from type 1 diabetes, but we know that there's a genetic component at play with this disease. We also know that it's not just genetics, that the majority of people being diagnosed with type 1 diabetes are still people without family history. So we have come a long way to, the teplizumab drug that I shared with you about that is delaying the onset of type 1 by over 2 years in the clinical trial. And then research in general, when I started with JDRF, I'm now in my 15th year on staff. And when I started with the organization, I think we were funding 4 human clinical trials. And now we have over 70 human clinical trials underway. And that certainly speaks to the progress that we are doing so many things and have so many things at that point in the pipeline. And then this slide shows just the leverage. So what is exciting is that when people donate to JDRF and fundraise for JDRF, obviously that's making a huge impact, but there's this sort of secondary impact as well. Basically, for every $100 million that we fund in type 1 diabetes research, we're able to leverage $300 million. So just that multiplier factor of being able to attract other funders into the space is helping those dollars to go further. And then this slide just shows how JDRF is making an impact. Again, that cumulative research funding, over $2.5 billion, 180 new research grants in 2019. That special diabetes program that has been nearly $3 billion in federal funding and over 70 human clinical trials. And then advocacy is the other big important work that we're doing in order to cure type 1 and improve lives. So I wanted to share with you just a little bit about what we're doing in that space. So you may be familiar with the special diabetes program. So this is basically a program through the federal government where we are able to secure $150 million annually. Well, the amount has changed over time, but most recently $150 million annually that is specifically earmarked for type 1 diabetes research. So those are dollars that are not coming to JDRF, but are being invested in type 1 diabetes research, where we then are able to put the JDRF funds, deploy them elsewhere. So it's such an important part of what we do. These are really the three main objectives right now that we are focused on in the advocacy space. So coverage, we want to make sure that people are protected, that type 1 diabetes does not keep people from getting insurance coverage. Affordability is, of course, a huge problem, systematic problem that we are focused on trying to make advancements there. And then choice as well. We think it's important for people that live with type 1 to get to choose the technology they use to manage their diabetes rather than their insurance company choosing that for them. So we do all kinds of things in the advocacy space. I think if you aren't already signed up as an advocate, there's a lot of opportunity to help us get our message out there. So it's not just our work that we do with the federal government, but it's also work with the insurance companies, with the FDA. I think the FDA is a great example of the work that we've done. So when we started with the artificial pancreas project back in the day, there was no roadmap. There was no list of here's what needs to happen in order to get the regulatory approval to bring those devices to market. And so JDRF had to push really hard on the FDA. It even got a little dramatic, I guess I would say, where the FDA still wasn't providing the information needed to keep those things moving forward. And so we took all of the power of our community and turned the heat up, had people making phone calls. We took out full-page ads in the DC papers saying the FDA needs to step up and provide this guidance, and it worked. And what's so exciting is that we've gone from that kind of a relationship with the FDA where we were having to really turn up the heat, to now we have this very collaborative partnership with them where we are, our team in DC is having regular conversations with the folks at the FDA just to keep them informed. It's very collaborative. Lately, we've been focusing on trying to get them to understand, right now, when we're looking at new devices and new therapies, most things are being measured on, does it improve your A1C, right? That's always been kind of like the go-to to see if something is helping to better manage type 1 diabetes. What we have been having conversations with them about lately is trying to help them to understand the psychological and emotional burden of the disease, and helping them to understand that if there are new therapies or new technologies that don't do anything to change A1C, if there's something that, my A1C stays exactly where it is, but I'm able to think about type 1 diabetes a lot less. I'm able to sleep through the night knowing that I'm not gonna have a low blood sugar, all of those things, that matters too, that is also an outcome that we need to be measuring when considering whether or not to have these new things come to market. So some good work happening there. Insulin affordability, of course, is a top priority for JDRF. I never want to miss an opportunity to share with people that that we are working on this, that this is a systematic problem that is not going to be fixed overnight, but that in the meantime, no one should go without insulin. So we have a whole list of resources. None of them are long-term global fixes, but we don't ever want someone to have to ration insulin. There are programs now through the drug companies, especially right now with COVID. They have been offering some additional things through those cost reduction programs. And so if you or anyone in the type 1 community that you know of ever needs help being connected to those resources, please be sure to let us know. And this is how our advocates can help. So we have opportunities that come around. You can see the URL here at jdrf.org/join. If you sign up as an advocate, you'll receive either text messages or emails, however you sign up, to get your info when there are particular things that need your attention, where we need you to send an email to your legislator. There's templates and it's easy to do. And then sometimes we have need for people to sign petitions. We need to get the attention of healthcare leaders, things like that. So lots of ways that you can get involved and help us in the advocacy space. And then this slide just talks about all the different ways there are to help, to get involved and to help us move our mission forward. So obviously the exciting things that I have shared with you all today, none of those would be possible without your support, without the support of all of our wonderful donors and fundraisers. So this just provides a little snapshot into some of the ways that people can get involved with JDRF, whether that's the ride or the walk, the gala. We just announced this week, I think that was this week, a partnership with Ragnar Relay. And of course, in this environment, we're doing all kinds of things where people can participate virtually. So lots of exciting ways to get involved if you are not already. So this final slide, just encouraging you all to join us, to participate with us. And I wanted to call our attention to the clinical trials website. So like you heard, there's over 70 human clinical trials that JDRF is funding. Of course, there are many other human clinical trials beyond that being funded through Special Diabetes Program and other funders. And some of the way that we feel like we can help and you can help to quicken the pace of our progress is by making it easy for people, the researchers, to get people signed up for these clinical trials. Sometimes that's the main barrier in getting the results that we're wanting, is getting people signed up to participate in clinical trials. So if you go to this website, jdrf.org/clinical trials, you can put in all your information and kind of where you're located and how old you are, that kind of stuff, and it'll tell you what clinical trials you might qualify for. So a great tool and a great opportunity for people to get involved in a very tangible way. So that is it. That is what I wanted to share with you all. I hope that you have found some of this information encouraging, exciting. I hope that there's a little nugget of information that you might share with a friend, but certainly am happy to take questions from folks as well.